Anyway, so let's talk about original Theros, because you can't really talk about this set without talking about what it's responding to. Original Theros, Tommy, you've already said this is the last great Magic set for you. Why do you say that?
So original Theros was, I think, a really great draft environment. And I think it would be better remembered if it did not come after a long string of great Magic draft environments. But like the Black Devotion deck was really interesting. I
Yeah.
think a couple of the common power levels are maybe a little ridiculous. So I think earlier you sort of alluded to the fact that you got pretty sick of getting hit by a 5/5 flying Wingsteed Rider on turn 5. But
Yeah.
I think overall, like the decks really were different and interesting, and all of the mechanics were great. So Devotion played great in draft. It ruined Constructed, so maybe that's a separate topic to mention. Bestow played amazingly, and those are cards I find myself coming back to constantly whenever I'm looking for solutions to various problems, either as a player or as a designer. And Monstrosity, I think, is one of the best mechanics they have not brought back. And Monstrosity was really, really great, and really, I think, hit the right place for a mana sink where it let you do something exciting but only once,
Yeah.
rather than like a lot of the mana sinks. And there's even one in this set that's like, oh, for 5 mana you can scry one a bunch of times, and that's just sort of like, it's not the mana sink that's going to excite me as a player. Even if, yes, I acknowledge if I draw a land and I have nothing else to do, it's good to be able to scry one for 5 mana. It's still not that exciting. So I think Monstrosity really hits that goal in a way that no other mechanic has. So that is a huge part. Now Theros, I'm talking here entirely about Theros the set. Theros the block kind of fell off because this was back when sets had 3 pieces to them. And so Theros, the original set, they put all the good, neat stuff in. And then they made 2 more Theros sets, which I think also is part of why people are less excited. And then they convinced people kind of by accident that Theros was meant to be an enchantment set or enchantment block, and it was not an enchantment set or an enchantment block. It was a set with some enchantments as a way of sort of capturing part of the theme.
Yeah.
And then in the last set, they tried very poorly to try and like say, oh, but here's some enchantment stuff you wanted, but this was not the enchantment stuff that anyone wanted, I don't think, even if Eidolon of Blossoms is one of my favorite cards. But I think it sort of fell off. And then Journey to Nyx itself was a set that just had a ton of individually cool stuff in it, but I don't know that it's a lot of people's favorite set in the same regard.
Born of the Gods is my favorite failed set ever. Like, I love to study Born of the Gods and like, wow, I can see why all of these decisions were made, and it's so interesting, and the whole thing just feels like a failure somehow. But it is also kind of a poster child for sets just getting squeezed when you have the 3 set block, and like you just have to come up with stuff to do, but also fill in these cycles, but not steal innovation from other sets. It's just a tragic thing that I love to look at. Was there anything you didn't like about original Theros, or did you already talk about that? Just some of the commons, maybe what it did to Constructed in some instances.
So there was the possibility, certainly, that you would end up facing down some giant creature, and the removal was terrible because they didn't want it to be a bad idea to stack a bunch of auras on things.
Yeah.
Because that was kind of one of the things you were supposed to be able to do. So sometimes you would just lose, and I think that was a balance issue that they could have done a little bit better. In particular, I think if I were to speculate what happened, I think they ended up sort of sorry, I'm trying to think of the word for compensating. There we go. They ended up compensating in 2 different ways for the fact that putting a bunch of auras on things is generally a bad idea in Magic. One way was by making the common removal spell cost 6. And the other way was by making it so that when someone destroyed your pile of bestow creatures, you only actually lost 1 card. And so that sort of made it a good strategy in that particular set to just throw all your 5-cost bestow things on various creatures, and even like the silly like +2/+2 reach bestow creature Leaf Crown Dryad was it was a very
It was a
good
great
card in a
common,
limited
yeah.
environment. Much less Nimbus Naiad and all of the other
Oh gosh, Cavern
the other things.
Naiad.
Like they were all, with the exception of the red one, of course, they were all really good. And so that, I think, ended up being part of what could have been tweaked just a smidge and made it better for me.
All right, so Trevor, how did you feel about Theros as far as what it did well, what it felt lacking to you? You mentioned there were some small things and maybe some larger things you would have liked to have changed.
Yeah, the small things for me is I can very vividly remember when Theros came out. That was like, I started Magic around New Phyrexia, and that was a very fun time to start Magic because little did I know Innistrad was about to hit, and that was a fantastic beginning. And so New Phyrexia, Innistrad, Ravnica, that was a interesting lead up into Theros. And with Theros, I was really excited to see Greek mythology. I was really excited to see how they pull off enchantments. That was around the time that I had finally gotten actually really into Magic design and being able to actually like make cards that were not garbage. And I was starting to really understand the design principles. So it was really fun actually seeing my first set as a designer and not just as a player. Being able to look at that and both be able to predict things and to learn from it and stuff like that. So
it was a very well-intentioned set, or not well-intentioned, but it was a very intentional set. Like,
exactly,
they weren't just throwing a set together; there were specific things they were doing.
Yeah, it was definitely that golden age, I think, in terms of what Tommy's saying. Of these sets were really designed with meticulous intent, and sometimes that was not exactly the best way to do it. But other times it worked out pretty nicely. Like Innistrad really showed them that attention to detail could really give them dividends, and from there they were learning. Even Return to Ravnica, like there were mistakes there was some goofs, but for the most part they were making a meticulous machine there. And even Dragon's Maze was ambitious. It didn't exactly work, but they tried, right? And I thought that was cool. So with Theros, I looked at that really excitedly to be able to see finally the enchantment set. Finally, obviously I didn't exactly know until they said this is not an enchantment set, it's a Greek mythology set. And I'm like, okay, well at least there'll be some enchantments, cool. And then it came out, and Devotion still scratches an itch for me that very few other mechanics do. Something else that my friends know is I'm constantly trying to like recreate a Devotion, or at least find the same kind of niche that it hit, which is it's just so fascinating to me that it cares about a facet of a card that is relatively underappreciated throughout Magic. And while it's a riff on Chroma, so it's not entirely innovative, unique, the direct focus and strong flavor really helped, and it really makes you play the game in a different way, which is kind of fun. The things I didn't like about Theros are relatively small, like I said. Like personally, I think it was around the time of Innistrad and Theros that they kind of got into a certain model of top-down design that I'm not a super fan of, which is a little too slavishly devoted to the original material.
Yeah.
Like when Theros came out, I was really bummed because I'm like, it would have been cool to see Greek goblins and Greek elves and other things like that. Like we got a little bit of that, but I just feel like there should be a little more of a twist, And that did happen throughout the block. They did get more into interesting lore of their own devising, and I enjoyed that. Like the Nyxborn was nice. So even if the set wasn't great, I still enjoyed the actual flavor,
Yeah.
And mechanically, Bestow was fascinating to me. It was one of the weirdest mechanics I'd ever seen, and it's still probably one of the weirder mechanics of Magic. It was very interesting and very difficult to evaluate on first blush. Heroic was really cool. I think that one is a relatively underappreciated mechanic, while it has its own play pattern problems and all these other weird things about it, and it really warps sets around it. It's just a cool mechanic, and it also is doing its own relatively unique thing. So right off the bat, we have 3 unique mechanics, and then you have Monstrosity. 4 cool unique mechanics, because Monstrosity is also doing a new thing where monsters become monstrous, and that's really cool. And then lastly, like even before the Making Magic articles were coming out, it was really clear that they had a really interesting structure and division to the set, with the way that the mechanics were connecting to different parts of the world and really world building for you, and really strongly capturing the intended experience of achievement and grand journeys. And
So I was a little disappointed by Theros originally. All you say is true. I was not a big fan of heroic, and the reason for that is I really dislike mechanics that kind of pull you out of the fantasy of the game and into the rules jargons, the rules jargon of the game. Like, if you have a mechanic that cares about targeting, that just rubbed me the wrong way. The thing that I do like about heroic was it cared about something enchantments do. It was something intrinsic to what auras do that makes them unique from like artifacts or other types of permanents. One of the few permanents that target when you actually cast them. And that's not something you get in Theros Beyond Death, where you have caring about what enchantments do as opposed to just caring about having enchantments. And we'll get into that later. But yeah, any other thoughts about original Theros before we start talking more about Theros Beyond Death?
So one thing I wanted to say is that the original Theros was sort of like right at the infancy of Commander, or Elder Dragon Highlander as it was called back then. But it's certainly one of the sets that people pull most from. There are tons of commanders from that set that are well used.
Those gods are very popular and very splashy and resonant.
So it seemed like it was a given that now that Commander actually exists and they're intentionally designing for it, that Theros Beyond Death was going to be like an even bigger smash hit for Commander. And I don't know if we'll get into this later, but no. It was a complete whiff for Commander, I think, as far as that, which surprised me, given, again, how beloved the original Theros is by Commander players.
I don't know enough about Commander to judge like the individual Commander designs against the original Theros ones, but it seems like the main offerings are going to be, again, the gods, but the gods are, in some ways, just rehashes of the originals. Like, they're different designs, but the things that make them exciting are identical, if that makes sense.
I would agree with that. Yeah, they have like abilities that are things like, there's the one that's a sulfuric vortex, and it's like, if I'm designing this card for Commander, why am I giving Commander players a sulfuric vortex? It's just not what any Commander player wants or needs. Maybe someone in the comments will say that it's exactly the thing they want. And like, I know someone who built a Commander deck around the sulfuric vortex Commander, but it's just, it seemed to not understand that the gods were for Commander. Maybe they weren't designed for Commander this time. I don't know. It struck me as very strange, and is definitely something that, in retrospect, thinking about original Theros, was a big part of its continued success, I would say.
Trevor, any last thoughts about original Theros?
Nah, yeah, I think that covers it pretty nicely. It was an interesting set, very much of its time in ways.
Yeah, I was really excited to see where they would go in the return, because the world itself seemed to be going in a new direction. Like, I don't remember the exact story beat, but it was like Johnny was going around preaching against the gods and like smashing altars and stuff. And I was like, man, are they going to have like an atheist Theros where people don't believe in the gods anymore? And there's all kinds of crazy things that would happen to a world like that, you know? And I was thinking that Theros was going to not just be Greek mythology anymore, but really its own thing, because the world was changing and, you know, man's relationship to God was changing. But it seemed that this time that they definitely didn't go in that direction. But it also seemed like everything in Theros was exactly, on the world Theros, was exactly the same at the beginning of the story and at the end. Like, nothing really changed in between. Although, I guess, except Heliod is in the underworld now. This worked out. Okay. So, one thing that is definitely worth talking about, coming out of Theros, where did we think Wizards would go in a return to Theros? What kind of direction would make sense?
So, I will say first, without knowing anything about the subtitle of Theros, let's just say you told me you're returning to Theros, what do you do, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll talk about what does it mean when you add those subtitle Beyond Death, right? There were a couple really important plot points left behind after the end of original Theros. The world was pretty different, and there were some important characters and important situations. So one, Ajani was actively spreading, as you were saying with about the atheist stuff, actively spreading disbelief in the gods. He was, disappointed by Heliod and how he treated Elspeth, and with the interactions with Crufix and all this, they were learning that the gods are a lot more than just deities that can rule over this world benevolently, right? And so Ajani was working with the already atheist Leonin and trying to spread that message that these are not gods you should choose to believe in, and that your belief has power over the gods and not the other way around necessarily. So that would have been really interesting to explore. And that would be the kind of thing that I'm not sure about what mechanically you would do to explore that, but I do think that would be very much, I would expect to return to devotion if that aspect is going to be explored.
Yeah.
The Nyxborn, really cool mechanic. Enchantment creatures are absolutely a home run and need to be done more often. So I would 100% expect enchantment creatures to come back. I would have thought that they would have returned to an aura feel as well. So I was expecting some feeling of auras, but more generally enchantments in general. I expected an enchantment mechanic. I did not expect constellation. I wouldn't have expected constellation. I just expected an enchantment mechanic of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
Probably I would have expected a relatively novel mechanic, something a little in the space more like bestow than like constellation, because to me, to make enchantments a good mechanic kind of implies you're going to have to explore some relatively innovative space to make it work. And then once you add the subtitle Beyond Death, that was important because Elspeth was left in the underworld. So at the very least, I would have expected them to address that. But knowing it's in the underworld, everything changes, right? Now I have all these different ideas whirling around. Like, well, auras, that's fantastic for the underworld because auras go to the graveyard alongside their creature. So your graveyard fills up twice when you lose that creature. Now, if there's something that cares about the graveyard, right, that would work well with that. I expected some graveyard mechanics. I expected a more tragic feel because we really got the sense of Greek heroism from the original Theros. I expected a sense of Greek tragedy. After Dominaria, I 100% expected sagas to return. It is a very clean way to add more enchantments into the set. They are sorceries that happen multiple times, so they basically fulfill the function of a sorcery, but they count as an enchantment. They go to the graveyard. It was a 100% perfect match. I had talked about this with people before Theros Beyond Death was even announced.
I think I remember that.
Yeah, because I really, really thought once I saw sagas, I was thinking sagas as a Greek tragedy set would be really, really cool, where we explore Elspeth's situation, we see it from a tragic perspective, and then she tries to escape or something's happening, and it follows the beat of a Greek tragedy instead of these Greek epics that the original was inspired by. So it's still Greek mythology, it's still rooted in all those things, but now we get to use radically different flavor and function and experience, because now we're telling a very different kind of Greek story, and you get to have all the other stories like, trying to remember some, but like Orpheus is a classic example, was a little touched upon in the first set with Rescue from the Underworld, but stuff like that, all these different veins of space that wouldn't have felt as fitting in the original Theros because they weren't stories of achievement and success and victory.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I like that that perspective. Tommy, what were you thinking that is the direction that Wizards was going to go?
So I have to say, I think to answer that question in a slightly oblique way, the thing that surprised me most was how long they waited, because WotC is not generally known for their patience with the story. Like, there was the whole, like, oh, Emrakul is missing. Where is Emrakul? Followed immediately by a set where there's these mysterious tentacle things going on Innistrad. Who knows what's going on?
Yeah.
Whereas this, they really wait. I mean, it's been almost 10 years. It's not quite 10 years, but it's been a long time because, again, they really leaned into the fact that, okay, Elspeth is dead, but she's going to come back. I don't think it was remotely a secret that Elspeth was going to escape the underworld, and they waited a while, and I guess the longer they waited, the more I sort of expected it to be a more impactful thing than I ended up feeling it was. Maybe I'm just like so detached now from the magic story that it was way more impactful than it felt to me, but it definitely did not feel to me like, oh, Elspeth is everywhere and this is now like the age of Elspeth or whatever, in that the way that we've had like a year of Chandra and a year or decade of Jace or whatever. I didn't feel like that was really centrally about Elspeth in the way I would have expected.
I didn't feel like a journey of Elspeth. I just felt like there was one card that told me what happened. It's called Elspeth Conquers Death. And and it was like one of the first spoilers. I was like, oh, okay. There's the story.
It's kind of like, imagine the card was just called Elspeth Beyond Death. And it's like, cool, title drop, awesome. You know, it's like very, very much a blunt force instrument of delivery there.
Yeah.
The story in general was really weird with this set, of course. And that's even issues outside
of design.
The set entirely, but like
that's fair.
It really made it difficult. And I think that this is a fair thing to say, which is you can't. I actually had a really interesting conversation with my with fiance about this. She doesn't play Magic. She very pointedly avoids it. And when I was telling her about the new Magic set, the flavor of it and all, you know, she was intrigued, but she's like, well, how can I really appreciate any of that on the cards? Because you can't tell a story through cards, right?
That's always the problem.
Always the problem. And I told her that. I said straight up, like, yes, you've hit it. Like, that is the issue that these people face when they're designing these sets. Like, you're trying to capture a story through cards, and that's really difficult. I think a part of the reason that the golden ages of design have worked so well is because with Innistrad and with Theros, there was a story. One, they told the story through 3 arcs of sets instead of within a set. That way you actually do get a chronological feel. And 2, they focused much more on the worlds and how they change rather than individual characters. So that way, when you see this 3-set block of Theros, there's a bunch of people from space, and then you're going into space to kill gods. You know, like it was very clearly a narrative arc of what's happening to the world. Well, it's doing things. Suddenly there's a war against all these things from space, and then suddenly you're going into space, right? So that kind of progression of what's going on in the world was easier to convey. Now you have a single set, so you can convey the world just fine with that. Magic is fantastic at world building because of that. But the actual story is really, really hard to convey through cards because you can't guarantee that people are reading the cards in the right order, and you can't guarantee that they get certain cards at all. And so it just comes out this really weird mess.
Well, one thing that they can do is really hit a specific tone or a specific resonant narrative. So like with Theros design, Mark Rosewater's like, okay, I have to do top-down Greek mythology and enchantments. Like the way he writes it in the articles, it sounds like they just gave him those 2 things and they're like, do a mashup. I don't know. And he's like, okay, well, enchantments, that's probably influence of the gods. What is Greek mythology about? It's about heroes, influence of the gods, defeating monsters. And so he came up with this gods, heroes, and monsters design guide. And all the mechanics we talked about with heroic, with bestow, with devotion, monstrosity, they all hit that. And even if you don't know the story at all, in the gameplay, you get heroes using the influence of gods to defeat monsters. And so you can do an underworld Theros set with the resonance of this is the Greek underworld, and you have to find a way to escape. And I don't know that resonant narrative is built into the gameplay as much, even though they literally have a mechanic called escape about getting out of the graveyard, and we'll get into that later. But it doesn't seem like all the mechanics and the whole set are all working together to get across a mechanically resonant narrative that anybody who doesn't know the story still gets that feel.
And even again...
sorry, you go, Carl.
Even again, I'm surprised that Elspeth isn't in it more. Like, you couldn't play War of the Spark and not understand that it was, like, about the fact that Nicol Bolas is a bad guy doing bad things and there's people trying to stop him. Like, he was in the art of I don't know, probably 30% of the cards, and in all the flavor text and just names of cards, just all over it was just smeared with it so that you would at least get like the very, very high level version of the story. Whereas, at least for me, I didn't get any of that from Theros Beyond Death, which is, again, like, I agree with what I think Trevor was saying about how like Magic is good at environmental storytelling. And so like if you think about like what are the best story sets of Magic, it's like Time Spiral, Scars of Mirrodin, Alara, and all of them have the theme of taking this world we know and destroying it. And Magic is good at telling that story, but they told that story, I don't know, a dozen times, and I think I've gotten sick of it. And so, like, yeah, I get why it's difficult to tell a more complicated narrative, but I feel like there's maybe a line where they could have at least hit some highlight here that they really didn't.
And it is harder with just one set. Like all of those other, all those other sets you mentioned, those were really blocks, and they could kind of arc it over a couple sets.
Like I just looked into it. Elspeth shows up on 4 cards besides herself.
Really?
4. There's a common, Triumphant Surge, an uncommon, Agonizing Remorse, another uncommon, Elspeth's Nightmare, and then a rare, Elspeth Conquers Death. That's it.
And you know what? In original Theros, they did this really cool thing. And, I'll say I did not expect us to spend this amount of time on narrative, but I think it's a really interesting conversation, because
I was going to comment on that. So, for the people who are listening to this and are like, why are they talking so long about this? I think you kind of have to, because a part of the return is the expectation of delivering on the story, and a part of the difference between original Theros and new Theros is the way they've approached the story and the way that sets are constructed, in that they're singular instead of based on 3 set arcs. So this is one of those things that you can't really avoid when you're talking about returning to Theros, because it's a huge difference in the structure of the narrative.
Well, and not just the structure of the narrative, but the structure of your mechanical suite, like the gods, heroes, and monsters things. That narrative was the mechanics, and they don't have anything like that with Theros Beyond Death.
Yeah. I just wanted to interject real quick to say that.
No, that's a great point.